Great. Well, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. I'll kick it off with a prayer, and then yeah, I can have a brief introduction. I mean, I don't know if I need an introduction, but we'll start with a prayer, and then go from there. And so just take a moment of silence in the middle of our day or beginning of our day. Just recall that the Lord is present to us, and we are present to Him. Heavenly Father, we ask you to continue to send your Holy Spirit upon us, upon all the finalists in this competition, that they may have the grace to grow fruitfully for your kingdom holistically and through their projects. We ask for a special outpouring of grace in this time, that we may come to know Dorothy Day, that we may learn from her, that we may see things with clarity and light, and have some application for our work and lives today. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I'm gonna give a presentation on Dorothy Day. So, little introduction for myself. I mean, most of you know me, but a lot of this emerged actually from a research project I did. Spent about a year just looking into the lives of a lot of renewal leaders in the church, like, everyone from Benedict and Francis to, Mother Cabrini, Dorothy Day, Don Bosco, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, dozens of them, trying to understand common characteristics of these renewal leaders in the church. What do they look like? What makes them tick? What are the patterns for how they've led? And so what I've been doing for the accelerator, we're gonna have some case studies on these leaders, looking at different aspects of their life. And so this is the first one during Mother Cabrini during the kickoff event, was more of kind of like hey, here's a presentation, TED Talk. This one I'm hoping will be more of like Harvard Business School style case study. So at Harvard Business School, you get like a 10-page case study, and it's got like a write-up of what happened in a certain case or situation, maybe in a company or an organization or even a country, and all stats and information. And then after you read that, you prepare for the class, and then really the participants, the students, in this case us, you are going to develop a solution to the case. So you're unpacking it, and you're putting yourself in the position of the protagonist. You're putting yourself in the position of Dorothy Day, or maybe an advisor to Dorothy Day, and you're thinking, what would I do in this context? How would I do things the same? How would I do things differently? You're trying to pick out pieces of information that help you to guide how you would build a solution in a given context. So I really want you to think about this a little bit so instead of like having you read 10 pages before, I'm going to kind of give you the presentation for about 20 minutes or so, zooming in on Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement, some of the key elements of it. But then we'll have a discussion for 30 minutes or so, and you're going to unpack the case. You're going to find out, what you're going to make arguments for what you would have done in her situation in various cases. You'll think about what are the applications for you today? Are there pieces of this you might integrate into your work or not? And together we'll try and develop an approach to this. So keep that in mind as we're going, okay? Before we do that, I want to kick off like just kind of popcorn. We'll go around, just maybe say one, or doesn't have to be everyone, but if you have a word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of Dorothy Day, share that, before we get into the case, and then we'll see if any of that changes or evolves as we go through it. Anyone have a word or phrase when they think of Dorothy Day? Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day.
Direct.
I'll say something. This Matt Smith. Radical.
Matt Smith. Radical. All right, Martin.
Direct.
Direct. Michael Rourke.
I don't really know much about her, so
okay.
I'm here to learn.
Yeah, that's another. Well, yeah, that's a phrase.
I've always heard she was determined.
Determined. Okay.
Passionate.
Passionate. Okay. John Sikorsky.
Gritty.
What is it, gritty?
Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. So Jay put it revolutionary and controversial. Okay. So yeah, and that can be a good thing too if you want to put things in the chat. You know, you can do that as well as we go along. Any other thoughts on Dorothy Day before we kind of kick it off, dive in?
This is Dave King. The word integrated comes to mind in terms of prayer into action.
Awesome. Integrated. Paul put in willing. Good. So we're seeing kind of a coalescence of some themes here. Brave, Nancy. Okay. Good. Okay. Great. So we'll I'll go ahead. All right, we'll go ahead and dive into the presentation. So this will be, go through about the presentation about 20 minutes. It's going to really kind of zero in on some of the key things for life, and then we'll unpack it in discussion afterwards. Try and build. And I think DJ is not on the line, but
I'm here.
you are here. Excuse me, I didn't see you. DJ will be taking notes, and we'll kind of coalesce some things around that too. So, okay, share my screen. Okay, so we'll dive in. We'll start with the video of Dorothy Day. Get you to see her in the flesh, which is a great grace of these more recent leaders.
If your brother is hungry, you feed him. You don't meet him at the door and say, "Go be thou filled," or wait for a few weeks and you'll get a welfare check. You sit him down and feed him. And so that's how the soup kitchen started. As a matter of fact, we didn't start it at all. We were feeding a house full of people, but the soup line started because one of the men who had charge of the clothes room didn't have any more clothes to give out, so he began saying, "Just come in and have a cup of coffee." And so pretty soon a line formed at the door. And Peter Maurin was always in favor of soup, being a good French peasant, so it became a soup line. And we still have the soup line, a couple of hundred people a day coming in. And then too, our Lord left himself to us as food, bread and wine. And I would say that sitting down and breaking bread with people, that the disciples at Emmaus knew him in the breaking of bread, and so it's far easier to see Christ in your brother when you're sitting down and sharing soup with him. You don't any longer see the destitute or the drunk or the disorderly or the unworthy poor.
I think in one of your books you said that.
Okay, so that gives you a little snapshot of Dorothy Day. I think encapsulates a lot of these things that we just said. Actually, let's look back even further. So that was her in the 1970s. Let's look at the beginning of her life. So she was born 1897, an Episcopal household, never really adopted a faith growing up, was drawn to radical causes from very early on. So you see a picture of her on the right as a pacifist protesting World War I. She was drawn to communism. She was an atheist, and she adopted a fairly wild lifestyle during this time. So, she was involved with the flapper lifestyle in the 20s, and she was also a journalist. Developed a reputation as a great literary figure in the country. So became kind of famous. She was had affairs with different journalists and literary figures. It was said of her she could drink anyone under the table. She went through some dark personal periods during this time. She was living in New York. She had an abortion. She attempted suicide during this period. A lot of struggles in this kind of early phase for Dorothy Day. She became involved with a man named Foster Batterham, who was also an atheist and an anarchist, but she was very kind of passionately in love with him. She became pregnant, decided to keep her baby, who was born in 1926, named Tamer. But the birth of her daughter really catalyzed the growth of her faith. She became drawn to spiritual things. She started learning about the Catholic faith. decided to be baptized with her, along with her daughter, and around this period, and really started growing more and more in the faith. And she began applying her literary and journalist skills towards working for Catholic periodicals and newspapers. So she started writing for Commonweal and other publications of this time. She was trying to seek a way of integrating this desire for serving the poor and kind of these more radical causes that she had with her Catholic faith. And she was searching for that. 1932, she is in Washington, D.C. doing some work, and she goes to the Basilica of the National Shrine, and she prays. She has this very heartfelt prayer with tears, and she prays that some way would be open for her to work for the poor and oppressed. It's one of these just kind of self-offering prayers, and it was kind of a major point in her life, she would say. Lo and behold, that same year, a guy named Peter Maurin shows up literally at her doorstep, goes into her kitchen, she comes in her home and starts talking to her about this idea of a Catholic worker ideals. And he says here, the truth must be restated every 20 years. And he's trying to find a way of expressing the truth of the faith that's relevant for that present time. And so he is just asked that you mute your audio too, if you can, please. He's trying to find a way of communicating the Catholic faith in a way that kind of makes sense in that time and place. And so he has ideas for a paper and a Catholic worker house. And, he's kind of like a Socrates, wandering around, sharing his ideas, engaging people in conversation. Dorothy Day said of Peter Maurin that when people look at Peter, they change. She had a great reverence for his holiness and for his living of authentic living of the gospel. He was a very simple man, but he was really a co-founder in the Catholic worker movement. And she says that it was his idea, and then if it weren't for him, the Catholic worker movement never would have been born. What is going on at this time? So 1933, height of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment, bread lines. This is a disproportionately Catholic population. So, a lot of immigrants at the time a lot of the immigrant population was Catholic. And so minorities, Blacks, Catholics are a large part of this unemployed population. And Dorothy Day is not seeing, Catholic Church is not really articulating a way of serving these people or their needs. And so, she says, if the old societies are too stodgy to take care of these new needs in a changing world, then new societies should be formed. So there should be new approaches to addressing the needs of the people at the time. What else is going on? So the Communist Party is growing in influence and attractiveness as some of the failures of laissez-faire capitalism are emerging. And so, here she says, is Christianity so stale that it cannot deal with communism? What is the Christian response or Catholic response to communism, which is she feels that a lot of Catholics are being drawn to this atheistic communism because the church doesn't have a good response to it. So what are some of the programs that she's coming to buy into what Peter Maurin is saying and becoming attracted to these ideas and these programs? And so what they're articulating are houses of hospitality, so ways of loving and serving brothers in need, so brothers and sisters in need, and in a community context. So loving as she said in that video, really becoming close to the person in need in front of you in the flesh. A paper to communicate the church's teachings on social justice to this population, often unemployed or underserved population. And then also farming communities, which are less known about and didn't take off as much, but farming communities where the dignity of work can be emphasized. People can work on the land and be in communities. It's very monastic concept, actually. Some of the guiding principles of the Catholic worker, I won't go through all of them, but I tried to match them up with works of mercy and Catholic social teaching. They were very intentional about how their guiding principles matched with the works of mercy and Catholic social teaching. So they're trying to incarnate the works of mercy in for the needs of the people at the time. So they decide to move forward and start these Catholic worker programs in the height of the Great Depression, 1933. And they're going to be entrepreneurs and launch something with no money. And she's very inspired by, Dorothy Day is inspired by one Peter Maurin, who says, he says in the Catholic Church, money has never been necessary. So, he's reflecting on a lot of the movements and orders that were started throughout history, whether the Franciscans or others with very little or no money. Dorothy Day was very drawn to St. Teresa of Avila, the founder of the Discalced Carmelites, and who built monasteries all over Spain in the 1500s. And Teresa of Avila said, Teresa and 3 ducats can do everything. So a ducat was a currency in the currency for a period of time. And it was about $500, 3 ducats. So Teresa and $500 can do everything. So Dorothy Day was inspired by $500 in today's terms, and in the 1930s would have been even less. But she believed that this, if it was God's will, this would happen. So she just sets out to do it, really. And they start first a Catholic worker house, and it was a house in New York, and the rule, she said, are works of mercy. This is the fundamental rule of the house. And so they're first of all places of encounter. The people who live there live in voluntary poverty. They would have soup kitchens, serve the poor, the unemployed, as a way of just really connecting with them and serving them in the flesh. So the people who lived in the Catholic worker houses, who would be working there, would they would sometimes have other jobs if they could, and cobble together money. They would raise funds on their own to help support the house. Sometimes they would buy the property. Sometimes they would just rent them. But they tried to live kind of like as the early apostles did, or the early disciples in the Acts of the Apostles, holding all things in common, and serving those in need. So looking at some of the growth of the Catholic worker houses. So first house, 1933, about 30 houses at the cusp of World War II, continue to grow. So they, the typical growth, it was more of a confederation of houses than it was an organized business model per se. So often what would happen is you'd have like recent college grads who are unemployed or kind of very idealistic come and stay in the house, become inspired, and then maybe go back to their own city and start a house someplace. There were other ways that they would occur, but it's very organic. As Peter Maurin liked to say, that they were an organism, not an organization. So there's kind of a loose model here. Dorothy Day eventually did write up some guiding principles and norms for the communities, but they struggled over this time. In terms of, sometimes houses would start and they would close. Dorothy Day lamented the fact that there was sometimes people working very hard, but sometimes she would find kind of people that they weren't pulling their weight, or they weren't working very hard in the houses, or she would encounter people that were not living according to Catholic teaching. They were, maybe they were partying too much, or kind of inappropriate behavior. So not that this was necessarily the norm, but these things were happening, and during the time, and I think that's important to bring out, that there were challenges as things started to grow, which, quality management, quality control is a challenge for any organization and company as it grows. So important to recognize this. They mostly raise money by donations. I think it's a great contrast, though, to Mother Cabrini in her case, where it was, this is much more organic. Mother Cabrini would go and cut a deal and found an institution somewhere, and then like set up a business or an organization to run it. So you just see a very different kind of management and leadership style. And even the connection, again, Dorothy Day was very inspired by Mother Cabrini. She said once, I have $15,000 for this property, but I need 10,000 more. So I must take to reading Mother Cabrini again so that I get in the mood for asking for money. So she did become a pretty good fundraiser, Dorothy Day, but it wasn't a natural thing for her. She really had to kind of work at it. Let's look at the paper. So they launched the paper also in 1933. And the purpose of the paper, Dorothy said, was to popularize and make known the encyclicals of the popes in regard to social justice. So she really wanted to communicate the church's social justice teaching in a way that connected with the needs of the people at the time, was her goal. And it was priced at 1 cent, 1933. The average I thought that was like, well, that's really cheap, but 1933, the average newspaper cost was 2 cents. So it's not it's not too out of market. In terms of the first paper, it was $57. They printed 2,500 copies from Paula's Press. She basically, the first paper, she just kind of got it out there. She cobbled it, got some people to write articles. She cobbled together, she raised some money from a few priests and sisters. Actually, somebody made a $25 donation. She postponed some of her electrical bills to get the paper out of the door. She found ways later to reduce the cost. She got the cost down, kind of developed a more efficient printing format. They raised money through selling the paper for a penny. It scaled rapidly. I mean, within a year, they went from 2,500 in their edition to 100,000 in the circulation. So it was just massive exponential growth in the early months and years. Really seemed to have struck a chord with people. And they also put fundraising appeals in the paper. So it became kind of a machine for raising money to help support the houses as well as market the idea and get the concept out there, this vision out there. So really emerged into a movement, if you will, within the Catholic Church very quickly. The people who sold the paper as part of their business model is they were to see it more as a sacrifice than a job. So it was kind of an offering. There was a spirituality to selling the paper and being involved and getting out there. And they emphasized selling the paper on street corners and to have a real interaction with people, to connect with them. So there was this kind of, just as Jesus kind of encountered people, they wanted to encounter people with it. So there was a spirituality that built up around it as well. The target profile of person that would typically buy it was often lower class, people that may be unemployed or that were, on academics, people that are social activists, people that were religious, priests, but also, there were non-Catholic people that were very interested in the paper as well, and that bought it and became involved. The content of the paper dealt a lot with labor issues. They would cover strikes, strikes that were going on, like a farmer strike in the Midwest, Black labor issues in the South. They would address issues of anti-Semitism in these early days. They even started covering international issues. In the 1940s, the paper, I don't have those numbers here, but the paper started to decline in circulation because they were very pacifist, and World War II, and the country was largely united behind the war, and so it became less popular during that time and never really regained that fervor that it had in the 30s. But Dorothy Day remained the editor of the paper to when she died in 1980, and it still has a very similar format that it did then. One story of the paper too, there was a man who went to live in a Catholic worker house with Dorothy. He was from Harvard. He graduated from Harvard, and he went there, and Robert Ellsberg, and he was in the Catholic worker house for a year. And Dorothy Day, after a year being there, he wasn't even really Catholic, but she was like, "Do you want to be the managing editor of the Catholic Worker?" This is in the 70s, but it shows you a little bit of her style. She wasn't out there doing a whole lot of interviews and trying to find the right person. She was kind of like trusted in God that person would show up. And he ended up running the paper for years, and he converted to Catholicism and became a very ardent Catholic and devotee of Dorothy Day. But he just went there kind of out of curiosity initially, and ended up running the paper. So it gives you an insight into her management and leadership style too. Speaking of which, these are some quotes of things that people said of her. So, and this reflects what some of you said earlier, like, she's described as diligent, direct, commanding, opinionated. There was a presence about her, but at times she could be playful. The Robert Ellsberg, who worked with her for years, said that she would watch TV. She enjoyed some shows, Masterpiece Theater. She was also very empathetic and compassionate. So there's a story of Harvard professor going to visit her, and she's sitting down with people at the table, homeless people, and she says to the Harvard professor, instead of saying to them, "Excuse me, let me go talk to this important person from Harvard," she says to him, "Who are you here to speak with?" Implying that everyone is just as important as her, and leveling the playing field. She said she said here on the right, there's too much talk of raising up of leaders and too little of raising up of servants. And so this great emphasis on servant leading by serving. What was her spiritual routine? For decades, she would rise, kind of crack of dawn. Liturgy of the hours was a big part of her daily routine. The breviary. She would also have some personal prayer. She attended mass every day, in the morning. Every week she went to confession. Saturday evening was her typical time. It's very important for her, that confession. She had a great reverence for that sacrament. Annually, she would try and go on a retreat. Retreats were difficult for her. She was a very kind of people extrovert person, and so that time of silence was often challenging, but she found great growth in it and was faithful to it. She became a Benedictine oblate, so you can see that fit of monastic spirituality, prayer, and work being integrated into her life. She was also, I think this goes back earlier, but she was very faithful to church, believed very strongly in following church teaching and adhering to the magisterium as well, but trying to find applications for it. One thing she said on prayer, which is I think encouraging for some of us who struggle with prayer, but which all of us do really. My mind wanders, converses, debates, argues. If I get into 15 minutes of honest to God praying, I'm doing well. So she struggled in prayer, but she stayed with it because she knew its importance. She was a lifelong activist. Many people know her for this. She picketed. She would protest. She spent time in jail. She fought for. She gave a lot of. She was on the speaker circuit. Wrote a lot over the years through journalism, and then also her books. So there's a lifelong activism is a part of her approach. Looking at coming to the end of her life, late 1970s, you see a picture of her with Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Maybe similar figures in some ways. I put there's a New Yorker article, the New Yorker here, and David Brooks' Road to Character. So New Yorker wrote an article on her in this edition just a couple months ago, and it was covered a book that came out about Dorothy Day recently. But the tone of the article is very, very, kind of very laudatory to her. Now, New Yorker, reputation for more of a left-leaning publication, but just praises Dorothy Day. Within the same year, a book by David Brooks, who's a conservative commentator, he has a book called Road to Character, where he looks at character and leaders, and he has a chapter on Dorothy Day in there, and I read it. It's very similar. It's very laudatory, and so it's interesting that she is able, at least today, right now at least, to draw support and kind of admiration from people on different sides of the spectrum, politically and ideologically, and I think that's interesting and compelling. So I want to stop there and pull it back in and just let's have a discussion about it. So that impacts just a little bit into Dorothy Day's life, but let's talk about, put this question out there. So kind of tee it up. We'll dig in more into her life now, but I want to ask this question. How did Day's experience and the needs of the time shape the Catholic worker movement? I think this can be a warm up. So how did Dorothy Day's experience and the needs of the time help shape the Catholic worker movement? We'll just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into her life a little bit more specifically.
Well, as Michael clearly with what was going on with poverty in the 1930s, with World War I, World War II, she was seeing all around her just lots of huge needs and big problems, and so. To her credit, she was trying to solve those, which is great. She got involved. So I think it's actually was really helpful for me to hear what her background was, to see how that impacted her. Like as you picked that one video for her to feed people, but also to educate them. So that's beautiful.
She her autobiography is called "The Long Loneliness." And I'll just be a second. The Long Loneliness, and you read her life. She had a rough upbringing. She had so much tragedy in her life, and what I find just really inspiring about that is that, like, all those experiences she had when she was younger, you know, she had an abortion, she got stuck with a bunch of really bad guys, and she focused that after her conversion and built, you know, the worker movement afterwards. I mean, it was all like the fruits of all that suffering, and not in like in an abstract way, but like in a real concrete way. I mean, it was like, I bet she was probably thinking, what would I have needed when I was younger? And I want to build that.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think you can see how, you know, and it's, you know, we all can relate to this too, but like how God utilizes the experiences and of our lives, whatever they are, if we start to surrender to him, and like, he's not going to waste it. It's going to be used in some way. And I think she's a powerful example of that. Like, you know, this junk and like the suffering and the wounds, but those become sacred wounds that, yeah. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so just transitioning a little bit into, now let's put ourselves in Dorothy Day's shoes. So you're Dorothy Day, 1930s. What it, you know, or maybe yourself in her place. I mean, that may be a little easier, but, you know, what is she doing right? And what could she have done? You know, what would you have done the same or maybe differently during that time period?
I'm going to go again, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One thing that Dorothy Day is like a huge role model for me, but like one thing that she contends with a lot is she's an idealist, right?
Yeah.
And her idealism manifests itself in the way she actually operates things. So, for example, one thing that you said that I didn't know was that her worker houses were built in a confederation kind of a manner, and I think that's probably rooted in her kind of anti-authoritarianism kind of outlook, which is very idealist, right? But unfortunately, you don't hear much about Catholic worker houses anymore because the movements, I mean, they do exist, and there's one in San Francisco, another one in Oakland over here, but it kind of floundered a bit, and I just wonder if maybe had she adjusted that idealism and maybe spoke to some consultants or something, which is not something saints usually do, if maybe they would still be around today in their former glory. So yeah, that's what I think.
Something that comes to mind for me, I've already spoken, say it quickly, that sometimes, I think communism in and of itself is something that denies the reality of original sin in a way that actually trips up what some of the good that people try to accomplish. So I think when you made the comment about that there were some people who jumped on into the houses and were benefiting from the houses, but not doing their fair share. It's like, well, that's right. You know, like we've got to have original sin as something that we're looking at, and being aware that people are tempted to this. And so I was interested when you talked about that she started to work on some kind of principles, because I mean, that's what we do as Catholics, is we have these principles, and that's what she was doing as well when she was drawing from the writings of the church. So I guess back to you, John. Did she come up with any type of documents or anything to say, hey, this is how we're going to live?
They did. They did have that. You know, she did. She developed that of like kind of how they would live and some guiding principles. You know, I would say it wasn't as you know, it wasn't like a franchise, you know, where, hey, you're McDonald's and you want to start McDonald's, like, here's your playbook. You know, I'd say a lot looser than that, but she did develop some of those things. And to touch on that point too, she was really, you know, she became a Benedictine oblate. She's really drawn to, she believed a lot in the monastic model. And she does say in her writings, you know, like, she's like, I've never seen people work as hard as they do in monasteries. You know, with people, they're not paid. They take vows of poverty, but there was this intense focus on work for the common good. And so I think she was really inspired by that and trying to find ways of this is maybe my sense a little bit, but of adapting that in her contemporary context. But obviously they were worked in some ways and maybe didn't work in others. Martin, follow up on one of the things you said. Do you think then that, so she was intentionally, you saw in there, we're not a business. And she kind of, at the time, capitalism, communism were seen as kind of things you couldn't really reconcile. And there were a lot of failures of capitalism at the time. So I think she was reacting to business and was kind of almost anti-business a little bit. And so she was, I think, hesitant to implement systems and organizational principles and that sort of thing. Could you see, with that approach, could you see a reconciliation in that time to do that? Or is it like, no, you have to be kind of decentralized and more hands-off to avoid some of those problems, thinking about it in the context?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but one thing that I really love about Dorothy Day, when you ask, like, what's the first word that comes to my mind when I think of Dorothy Day, I think of direct. And what that looks like in my mind is Dorothy Day just sees the person of Jesus Christ. And she says, that's the direction I'm going in. To hell with all the ideologies that are around me. And sometimes she'll agree with people on the left, and sometimes she'll agree with people on the right. I don't think her intent is to pick a side, even for particular issues. But she's trying as best she can to be consistent with her faith, just keeping track of that goal, which is Christ. So yeah, she did have like an anti-business streak, but it wasn't because she was against businesses. She saw, all the corruption that happened, particularly in larger businesses. So I think she would make people feel like she was completely against businesses because sometimes in some cities they're actually an issue and they have to be dealt with. That's my best shot at John.
Sure.
I have a question, actually. Did she ever identify herself as a communist?
Early in life. But correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think that later in life she called herself a Christian socialist, I think.
Yeah, I think, early on she identified with a communist, but atheistic communism was not compatible with being a Catholic. And so, but I think she still saw some, some of the ideals of communism, of like community and common property, which has been always revered in the Christian context as well. She saw some of the ideals of that as things that could be brought out more from the Catholic vantage point in that time.
It's just interesting how when it serves as a buzzword, like someone who identifies as a communist, you justify violence meted out by the state because it serves the greater good, right? But then we can be less perceptive of these types of sensibilities when it's a conservative, or which you would even call like neoliberal argument, that the free market and Western democratic way of life ushers in this unprecedented degree of human flourishing when it's exported around the globe, right? Like God helps those who help themselves, that kind of thought. But then we become blind to the fragility of goodness and interdependent factors, which the flourishing is contingent on aspects of just serving the church versus serving a political ideology. And I think she was good at that, but these buzzwords like communism always leave a bitter taste in people's mouths, even socialism, It's just interesting in how we need to speak today about, when we're running our businesses and serving the church. Like, I see it too. You always have some priests that'll lean very right, some that'll lean very left, and they both want the same, they want to serve the greater good. But when you start throwing those buzzwords in there, it triggers a particular political ideology in a person, makes them dismiss everything else good that they have to say. I don't know.
Sure. I think that's a great insight. Like, you have to be very careful about, because these words have a lot of baggage that come with them, and in some cases a lot of evil too, right? So being careful in our language, I think is really important.
Maybe I can just add real quickly. So I think just to clarify, and you guys actually, I posted a little video. You can look at the digital library for week 4, and there's both the excerpt of the video that we just watched as well as another video. But I think Dorothy Day later in her life, she identified as an anarchist, and of course that term kind of might strike us as, oh my goodness, she's like trying to abolish and overthrow governments. And of course, if we have that association with the definition of anarchism in our mind, that would probably be anti-Catholic, right? Because there is a good to political institutions and institutions for injustice. But I think the way she understood anarchism was very much the case that, as Peter Maurin said, right, we need to build the new society within the shell of the old. And so I think for Dorothy Day, if you kind of really want to get an insight into the kind of principles with which she was operating, Quadragesimo Anno, or on the 40th, after 40 years, right, Pius XI's encyclical that he published in 1931, I think was a huge source of a lot of Dorothy Day's thought, because this was an encyclical in which, the Great Depression had just started, the Russian Revolution had happened. So Pius XI is trying to kind of analyze and look at Catholic social teaching from, the perspective of what's happened in the early 20th century. And so for Dorothy, who was actually very good friends with Father Virgil Michael, a Benedictine who brought the liturgical movement to the United States, for her, it was really the case that, to quote Pius XI, all permanent Catholic social reform began in the sanctuary, right? For her, really it was Christians coming together to worship corporately, right? That the liturgy is not something where we just go and, it's me and Jesus and I receive the Eucharist and I go on my way, but actually that corporate act, right, of being united in the mystical bond, particularly in the liturgy, right, then spurs us to social action. And so Pius X sort of wrote all about the liturgy, and then Pius XI, right, Virgil Michael and Dorothy Day would quote this as well. She would say, it's no surprise that following Pius X's writings on the liturgy, Pius XI then would write about social action. This is the era where Catholic action was founded in Europe as well, and Dorothy Day sort of saw this as her response, right, that the government has its own place and role, but it's not up to them, right, to solve all of these problems, that we have to really heal society by returning to a Christian life and Christian institutions. And I'm going to do that very radically by showing you what that means, right? So I think for anyone interested, you could kind of take a look at that encyclical of Pius XI to really kind of get a sense of, what she was promoting and writing in her paper, right, to try to sort of apply these teachings to the American context, but then also where was she drawing from, right? Because when she sounds kind of communist, well, you can see, right, the affinity between like some of the things Pius XI's writing, where he's critiquing sort of unbridled capitalism, but then also pointing to the errors of socialism, which he greatly denounces in that encyclical. So I think that's why she's kind of a confusing figure sometimes, because she uses these terms, but she's really drawing from the richness of this social tradition of the church.
That quote again, John, was all permanent Catholic social reform happens in the liturgy? Is that what you said?
Begins in the sanctuary. That was Pius XI. That was actually Pius XI in the encyclical he wrote to condemn the Nazi regime in Germany. But that was kind of the spirit of Dorothy Day, right? Picking up on that.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, it's more color on the the evolution of her thinking and where it comes from. Ask a little bit different question that kind of emerges from this. So, all right, so she didn't really focus on systems or organizations that much. Neither did St. Francis of Assisi, right? One of the greatest saints of all time, and like Franciscans are still around. And you could probably argue that Jesus didn't really either. So if some of these great leaders in church history haven't really emphasized kind of systems, organization, process, how do we think about that today for us? Like, are these things important for us? Why and why not? How would you think about that?
So this is Dave. One of the best sort of personality inventories I took was by the Siena Institute. Is it Called and Gifted?
Called and Gifted.
Yeah. Have you taken that, John?
I have, yeah.
It's so good. But it's a great inventory that helps you discern your gifts, the way you're wired in light of the Holy Spirit. So as I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking, Day was the founder, but I don't think she was the executive director, like long term. In my head, I was thinking, they're probably, because I've been involved with a number of ministries and nonprofits, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the phrase founder syndrome, where you have the charismatic initial founder, and unless there's a succession plan, that there's this period where unless it's passed on, those ideals institutionalized, I mean, in a certain way, codified in a very deliberate way, there's, things could fizzle out. So with the Franciscans and even with Jesus and St. Peter, I mean, they had to figure out, like, how do you, maybe a generation of the founders died. Like, how do we build an order or institution or the early church around what the Lord or St. Francis, the founder, if you will, it inspired us or founded. These are, boy, like, if you don't ask those questions, it could cause a lot of pain. And so that's one thing that came to mind today in your presentation. I'm like, were they supposed to discern, like, who's the ED, of Catholic worker after days retired,
I think these are great insights, and you see that in Francis, after he founds it, like, people are they're fighting over who's running it or what's going to happen. And, Jesus says to St. Peter, on this rock I will build my church, right? And you see a similar thing in entrepreneurship circles, right? Like, well, entrepreneur startups, like, there's a charismatic founder, start something, and then, like, when investors start getting in, they're like, how can we put a CEO who can run things, and that starts becoming a question. Yeah. And they often, like, look at Steve Jobs got kind of evicted from Apple, right? I mean, there are a lot of parallels, I think, there. And, it's something for us maybe to keep in mind as we develop our things, like, and I think you're so right on the called and gifted inventory, or maybe looking at other tests too, whether it's like the Berkman or, 16 personalities, et cetera, of, like, identifying strengths and weaknesses, quote unquote strengths and weaknesses, and finding those people to fill those gaps in us or to manage or run things. Because entrepreneurial type can often be very, like, vision forward and like, okay, what about the details and process? Well, we need people to do that.
So one thing I'm curious about Day, and this is a very a critique of somebody who's a hero, is like, hey, how self-aware was she about the limits of her gifts? And did she put people around her? Did she bring people around herself and empower them to say, look, I'm not good at that, you are. I want you to run with it. How did she discern that distinction? And if not, I wonder, like, where, with some of the ways the houses were set up, or to say, like, nope, we're not ready. I mean, in Mother Teresa, she was not, like, in a rush to found other missionaries of charity movements around, houses around the world. Sometimes it's painfully slow. So I'm wondering how self-suspicious was she? It's one question I have.
Yeah.
Hey, John, can I chime in? And I'm sorry to interrupt. And
please.
I know some of you have not met. I'm Matt Smith. I work with OSV, and so I started a little bit in the process. But I come from University of St. Francis for the last 17 years in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We, with OSV, actually sponsored a conference about Dorothy Day about 5-6 years ago. So brought folks together for 2 or 3 days at the campus. It was great. And Dave, your question and your sort of wondering, it fits both Dorothy Day and St. Francis well, because they both did have people around them that were what I would call good COOs. With the Franciscan order, there's a figure called Brother Elias that sort of built the order while Francis was alive and after Francis died. And I know John brought up in his biography, Roger Ellsworth, who did a lot of work in sort of putting the structure for a lot of Dorothy's ideas. If I'm correct, John, this is somewhat recreating something from the conference, but I think that was a great insight, and I appreciate you letting me just jump in on this. This is Dorothy Day's a sort of hero of mine too, and like I said, the conference we sponsored a few years ago was great. So.
No, and that's part of the beauty of this, the case method, I think, is like we all contribute different experiences and ideas and knowledge, and we're trying to kind of build something together. So I don't pretend to be the expert here, just more the facilitator. So thank you.
John, I want to add one thing too, where I feel like some direction that the conversation has gone are more the scale issues or the sustainability issues. But one of the things that seems really remarkable is that 3 ducats line, or the first few years. And if I had to almost define what OSV is seeking, it's they seek the people that are going to go out there and make a mess and then realize fast scale issues. And so whereas she might not like maybe there were foundational questions that she didn't deal with, but she did experiment rapidly with little, and evidently tapped into major zeitgeist issues of the generation that she was dealing with. And those might have shifted, and maybe the organization died with it because we couldn't adapt, or it didn't need to. But I'm really impressed with the early growth that she did.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And she had a lot of fears of starting it. She was very drawn to begin it, and Peter Maurin was kind of like, let's go. And one of the things that helped her in that was Peter Maurin. I remember a quotation that Peter Maurin said to her. He said, "The important thing is just to start." And the important thing is just to start. And height of the Great Depression, I mean, the most difficult time in U.S. history to start something. And so I think that we can keep. I think that's a good, helpful mindset for us too.
Well, it seems that what might cause you to be afraid of starting is exactly why no one else is, and may be also the cause of your success with it. And so if, for instance, the church, she had that line that you quoted, is the church too stodgy? And my reaction was, I'm like, well, you are the church. Like, you should not blame the church for not doing what you feel called to do. And so, so sometimes her cantankerous leftist things irk me when I listen to her, even though I'm very inspired as well. But there's some of those things where you could probably see that she was very resistant to the thing that she did. And that's just what might make her very real and empathetic. But what's helpful potentially to remember is that fear might actually be the foundation, like what you fear might actually be the foundation of your calling itself. So, which sounds like what the cross is. So her cross sounded very relevant to her mission.
Yeah, that's, and you see that too, I think, in the lives of these leaders, that the Lord kind of invites them to go through the pain that they're serving so that they can really experience it. You see that Mother Teresa of Calcutta, I mean, a lot of others. So I think that's a great insight.
Yeah. I thought of John Paul II and his childhood and everything he went through as a young man, was the crucible in which he was able to see so clearly, make the gestures that the world needed and his people needed. As I took in the presentation, I thought of, I remember after John Paul II died, there in Time magazine, I think there was this essay by this Anglican priest who, sorry, my earbud fell out. He became a Catholic priest, and one of the essay was about how, as he started to watch the way JP2 moved and engaged the world, his critics were from both sides of the political spectrum, from outside the church and within. And he was like, over time he tracked, and he saw that there was a deep consistency in the center, in the person of JP2, the dignity of the human person. And that center, being able to see that, witness that, is what enabled him to see as an Anglican, this is the true, what it means to be a Christian. And so I met my friend of mine, her father was close with Dorothy Day years ago, and getting to know him and his family, I could see their deep centering in the prayer and the liturgy, and also like an almost impatience with not being attentive to the neighbor or those in need. But there was this, at the heart of it, there was this integrated, like, you're one thing. You're not, overly concerned about the details of liturgy, or you're not blind to your neighbor, or you're not a communist. But there was this integration that, if you don't look carefully, it could look like this extreme from one angle or the other. Mm-hmm. But I love that. It's so Catholic. And so I wonder if Day had critics from both sides of the spectrum. I'm sure she did. Yeah. So.
Yeah, definitely she did. Yeah, and I think that's great insight. Something you said too about like, and maybe that's a kind of rhetorical question for the group, is what are the crucibles you're going through? What are the pains? What are the struggles? What are the challenges of this time? And how do you remain open to how the Lord wants to transform that into fruit, for your project, for your mission, for your life? and having the hope for that and the confidence that he's going to do that, because we're all going to have tremendous tremendous pains and struggles in this entrepreneurial journey, right? I want to ask one final, we have a few minutes left. Are there any takeaways you have from this discussion or the case that you may try and integrate, adopt, think about in your work? Like bringing it home.
I'll go. So I was listening to all of you talk, and I haven't heard much about her in the past. I was really like absorbing. But the thing that stands out to me that all of you were saying, even though none of you said it explicitly, was she wasn't perfect. She was a human who did what God wanted her to do every day, the way that God asked her to do it. From after she was praying and talking with the Holy Spirit, this is what she's supposed to do. So it's not that we're supposed to be perfect in our mission every single day, but that you have to keep on with your mission every single day.
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick, that echoes something that I've been kind of been talking about in our small group, but something I've come across is that you don't have to get it right, you have to get started. And I think there's a lot of fear in that. It's like, oh, we got to do this the right way. Well, you really don't know what that right way is. And there's a lot of false pride in that. Like, oh, well, I can be perfect in this. Get started, let God do it, and get out of the way. You know.
It's great.
A couple takeaways from me, even some things you said, John, that were helpful. I was zeroing in on it, then you said it. This whole thing of like, what's your crucible and are you living it? I haven't lived the crucible being on the streets and dealing with that kind of poverty. I have lived the crucible of the family. And so, and it's beautiful and good and painful and agonizing. So I appreciate that, because I wrap my arms around it and say, like, when I look at her, what would I do differently? Well, we have a different, I didn't experience what she did, but I have experienced what's happened in my family, and I want that for others. I loved, I've almost said this before, and I could tell I kind of put people off, but the whole thing that you mentioned, or that was said about like, this isn't a business, it's a movement. And that's how I feel like when it comes to families coming together, learning their faith, loving each other. It's like, I like, if I could go pour telling that message of like how important it is. And even Tim had said that in the very first presentation. He's like, the basic cell is like, you've got the church and the family. So I appreciated that, finding the truth, wrapping your arms around it and saying, I'm going after it. And then just as Paul was saying, it's like, we have to be careful not to worry about perfectionism. Instead, worry about, Mother Teresa again, about being faithful.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Any other takeaways, things? Great. Eric?
So why you call me out? No, I mean, the biggest thing that it always reminded me of was Mother Angelica starting EWTN, how great things can start from a seed of radical faith, of a faith that seems insane, because, common conventions predicates sanity on rationality and on reason, but faith, faith and reason are the two wings on which we kind of ascend toward God. Some good encyclicals on that. And so it's important for us to, especially when we're doing these things, like, one of my temptations is to really kind of get lost in reason, get lost in the numbers and the metrics and this, that, and the other. But honestly, like, sometimes the greatest genesis, sometimes the greatest cause of change or of I guess like impact or of whatever the word there would be, is actually just faith, and it's actually not the reason components. And sometimes, even though we're working on entrepreneurial things, we have to really do stay centered on faith and be willing to take what might seem to be unreasonable leaps, like ordering $250,000 of telecommunications equipment that Mother Angelica did. So it's a good lesson for me, and for anyone who I think is a bit more like quant and metrics focused too. Just remember that we're dealing in a special type of entrepreneurship that not just requires faith, but has faith as almost a leverageable asset to accomplish even greater things for the glory of God.
Great, thank you. Good quote. Leverageable asset of faith. I love it. And then also, God wants, you know, if you got those gifts of like reason and deduction and logic, like God's given.
I'm not saying,
reason.
you know,
Yeah, faith and reason, like you. Yeah.
One plus one can equal whatever we want it to, you know, as long as we believe.
Yeah. Great. Well, good. Well, it's been a great discussion. Really appreciate you all being present and diving into it. Hopefully there's some nuggets and takeaways for us and for you in your journey. And in the library, there was also some further resources on Dorothy Day if you want to explore that, some other videos and content as well that we pulled together for you. So keeping you in